Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video on myself, Jonathan MSP. Ukraine War Frontline update for the 27th of May 2024. If you don't know what the lines on my map mean, please check out the key on the screen at the moment, pause the video. Let's talk a little bit about the different colour pins on my map. Someone was asking me yesterday and I'm really confused, and it can be very confusing. There's a lot going on there. There are 3 lines of Russian defence, and there's also a Ukrainian defensive line, if I put it up, which is showing the grey zone effectively between the Russian and Ukrainian lines. Now, I have purple icons on here, pins with the camera picture in it. Those refer to images I might have on my map to support a sense of place when we talk about different locations. And then sometimes there are bright purple pins as well to suggest other things like bridges or culverts and whatnot. So we generally don't have those switched on, but you'll know when they are switched on. There are 6 colors of basic pins. Anything in red or dark yellow, so dark yellow or orange, sometimes there's slightly different shades, but that suggests a Russian advance depending on what the mapper is. These kind of light orange, light puce ones are Andrew Perpetua's Russian advances. The darker ones are Surat maps, which is the red lines. The blue lines Andrew Perpetua, but if a Russian advance, it's that color puce. And the yellow lines of deep state maps here are signified Russian advances by a darker yellow, and a very bright yellow indicates a Ukrainian advance. But anyway, those are the Russian advances. A darker blue is a Ukrainian advance. A lighter blue is a Ukrainian advance for Andrew Perpetua. That dark blue is for Surat maps. And as mentioned, the bright yellow is deep state maps, Ukrainian advance. So it does get a bit confusing, but once you're with me for long enough, you should get a handle on it. And I'll be, of course, always describing what's going on in each place. Sometimes I smash my words together because of my multiple sclerosis, so I will mix Russia and Ukraine up, and I really apologize for that. There's not a lot I can do about that. My brain just doesn't do what I want it to do. Right, we'll start. Thank you for allowing me that rambling introduction. We'll start in the northern area around Kharkiv, where the Russians have, for another day, seem to make no further advance. This is a really significant situation outcome from this, because it was portrayed in the press as this, situation of doom, where Russia were making this huge incursion with 50,000 troops, and Kharkiv was going to get surrounded, etc., 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 and it hasn't really turned out that way. Interestingly, there are lots of, and Zelensky made reference to this, there are lots of rumors about the Russians readying to attack north of the border, somewhere in the Sumy Oblast, which is this other oblast to the northwest of Kharkiv Oblast. And the Russians have some sort of 15,000 troops around there. I don't think they're particularly battle-hardened already, but they are supposedly poised to attack across the border, as according to several sources. I'm not sure that would be a wise thing. We are going to do a little bit of analysis of this attack in the northern area in a little while, with reference to a source Zhenya in Ukraine has sent me. But anyway, on the northern front in Sumy, as of the 25th of May, so it's a couple of days ago, an increase in the activity of Russian artillery and reconnaissance has been observed in this area. The General Staff is prepared for any scenario. The Ukrainian forces maintain a significant presence in the area. The majority of enemy formations being monitored consist of infantry, do not seem to have yet assumed an offensive posture. Whether or not this potential novel vector of attack is realised, rest assured that the situation is approached with the necessary attitude by the armed forces of Ukraine. Now, in that area of Sumy, I think the Ukrainians have built more fortifications. They are better prepared. Minefields, I think, will be in place. So the smaller Russian forces will have a harder time, I think, attacking in that area. But what can we make of what's happened around both Lipsy and Vovchansk sectors? The Lipsy sector, if you remember, is where the Russians seem to want to get close to Kharkiv so they can hammer it with artillery. At the moment, they're hammering it with those aviation-released guided glide bombs, as well as S-300 missiles and Iskanders and similar. But yeah, you have these two areas there. Now, if I go across to what Zhenya told me, I unfortunately I can't bring it up on this screen. What did the Russian offensive on Kharkiv Oblast achieve in 15 days? So this is a couple of days old, but it gives you a kind of synopsis. The enemy captured a border strip up to 70 kilometers wide and 10 settlements. All of these villages are located near the border, in fact, in the war zone, and there are only a few dozen residents left there. That's outside of Vovchansk and places, as a much larger location. The maximum depth of advance is the direction of the village of Lipsy, up to 9 kilometers deep into Ukrainian territory. So that's this area. As you can see on the map, it is deeper than anywhere on the Vovchansk sector. In the city of Vovchansk, the advance is up to 7 kilometers in the direction of Staretsia, about 5 kilometers. And at the moment, the enemy is entrenched in the captured territory, continues attacks, applies fresh reserves, strikes at our rear, and continues to process the tactical initiative. Although this being a couple of days old, it would also be worth adding that, and they've completely stalled, not taken any more ground, and appear to have been pushed back in some of those localized positions. On the 25th, though, Russian troops launched attacks in the direction of Lipsy and Vovchansk. They were repelled. The threat of Russian breakthrough in all directions has been repelled. A stable front has been created on the northern front. Wherever the Russians continue the attacks, the enemy suffers heavy losses. The commander-in-chief of the Ukrainian Armed Forces, Syrskyi, appointed his deputy, the former commander of the Odessa OSU, General Drapatoy, as the new commander of the Kharkiv OTU. Kharkiv residents and troops are provided with artillery, it's a bit of smashed translation there, but the troops are provided with artillery ammunition. The interaction of artillery and infantry, situational awareness along the entire front edge has been created. It's worth noting that Ukrainian command does not use brigades in this direction in separate platoons and companies, but does not scatter the troops, but cuts separate lines of responsibility for the brigades. If this were the case on the entire front, that would be good. As soon as the battle formations become tighter, the advance of the enemy became as difficult as in the Donbass. It is also worth noting that our command does not throw troops into quick and poorly prepared attacks to report on the allegedly taken measures, but primarily thinks about defeating and assigning losses to the enemy. Such a tactic fully responds to the situation. Yes, we missed a shot, but there is no need to rush because the score of the battle is not close. So to translate that into more understandable English, that is that they're not rushing into throwing troops defensively into these sectors, but they are trying to use their defenses cleverly. This is a really difficult area because there's an awful lot of lead flying around in terms of artillery and aviation from both sides. So both sides are using guided glide bombs. In fact, I've got some imagery here of Ukraine dropping some munitions, aviation bombing. So it could be the French AASM Hammers, could be JDAMs, Ukraine, or could be the GBU 39s. The Ukrainian aviation bombing Vovchansk district caught to the ground with Russians inside after it came under Russian control. Same strategy as what they did with Vovchansk City Hospital: lure the Russians in and bomb it. So that's the Ukrainians seriously hitting Vovchansk there from the air. Anyway, what I think this is the interesting summary and speculation from this military source. What are the future plans of the enemy in this direction? 1, to capture the ridge of dominant heights that control the border strip and the villages of Lipsy to Vesely to Ternova to Staretsia. So all along here you can see Ternova, Vesely, Lipsy. So that going along there. And then to capture the city of Vovchansk and a forest massifs with dominant heights around. So that would be around here as well. So really, you could argue that they want to do a bit of this, get there, join these places up. You could say get the forest there, actually come back around to there and have one larger salient that allows them to be able to pummel Kharkiv and give a buffer to Belgorod and draw Ukrainian resources over to this area. So number 3, they say connect 2 bridgeheads from Vovchansk to Lipsy, take control of the entire border strip. So at the moment, they're struggling to connect these 2 areas, and it seems they've been pushed back rather close to Zeleny, where they had a longer strip of control. And lastly, to bind and exhaust our troops with losses, to reduce their fighting capacity, to prevent them from being transferred to Donbass, to Chasiv Yar, Krasnoyarivka, Vuhledar, Pokrovsk directions. So, and then it goes on, there's a massive list of how the problems the Ukrainians had, and sort of blaming shortcomings of particular people in command and fortifications and some of the tactics, problems with a lack of ammunition coming from the west and soon enough, and also air force, the air advantage the Russians have, and the inability to strike within Russia. So all of those things that we already know about, why the Russians were able to get a quick roll through and into Ukraine, but have subsequently been stopped. I don't know that this was a good idea for the Russians. The Ukrainians have probably lost. It's probably caused more Ukrainian mechanized equipment to be lost, but I think the Russians are probably losing more troops. And I think if you'd shoved all those people into Chasiv Yar, they would have had more success in Chasiv Yar. I just don't think it's a great idea, but maybe I could be wrong. Anyway, coming out of that area, and we're going to, a little more in Vovchansk from Getty here. Ukrainian fighters from the 82nd Air Assault Brigade fighting the Russians in Vovchansk. There's the videos of strikers being used. So we've seen quite a lot of newer kit. We've seen strikers, which are the American armored personnel carriers, and although they have different elements on top, so you can have strikers with guns and whatnot. That is a guy poking out the top with a javelin, blowing up something in distance. Striker fighting vehicles are used in urban fighting to engage the Russians, and it's the idea that Ukrainians have pushed back in Vovchansk, in that central part. So if we go back to that area, it's the idea that the Ukrainians push back here. As we have seen, there's the grey zone according to Andrew Perpetua. The Russians push back further as far as Andrew Perpetua is concerned, and don't control as much of this area to the west there, compared to what the other mappers say. But yeah, a bit of difference there. So Vovchansk hasn't changed over the last 24 hours, or that any of the sectors in that area. Then we come to the northeastern axis from Kupiansk to Kreminna Svatova to Kreminna. You can see there are some changes along some of the usual places on this front line. Although no changes to Kupiansk-Sinkivka area itself. We're going to just have a mention of that, which is the General Staff have claimed that Russian troop activity has increased in that Kupiansk direction. Sharp increase of Russian troop activity in the direction of Kupiansk. That could be in relation to this attack up here. So one of the leading reasons for the Russians doing this, the objective was to draw Ukrainians away from this particular area, the Sinkivka-Kupiansk area, so the Russians could attack and have a greater ratio advantage in attacking there. But then what we heard is, because the Russians were stalling there, they were themselves drawing troops from the Kupiansk front line. I don't know how accurate that was, but it completely defeats the object of using this diversionary attack here. And again, it would have been more sensible to have just piled the extra 50,000 people into Kupiansk, into the Sinkivka sector, if that was really what your main objective is to take Kupiansk, right, by having a ratio advantage. I think the other sorts of advantages, like we can hit Kupiansk, have a buffer zone for Belgorod, hit Kupiansk hit Kharkiv with artillery here. I think those are arguably sort of post hoc rationalizations after the fact. So if we do attack here to draw troops away, then we could achieve X, Y, and Z. But we're not doing this in order primarily to achieve X, Y, and Z. We're doing this to alleviate areas of the front line. But that doesn't seem to have worked. So anyway, that's just my speculation there. Right, going on further to the south from Kupiansk area, we have further gains according to Deep State map and Surat maps. So these pins indicate where the lines were, and now we have some gains in that area south of Krokmalna, which has been fairly active for some time. I'm just going to take off the the grey zone line. So that's the Ukrainian defensive line for Andrew Perpetua. Just to clear it up, there's a lot of pins and lines going on there. So yeah, Russians making some advances in that particular area. In fact, we can see here on the on Surat maps that the Russians have expanded their buffer zone west of Kislivka along the railway. In addition, troops made new advances around Berestova and northwest of Novosibirsk. So that is in a number of places. Here we have around, I'm not quite sure exactly where that is, but it's on the way to, this is somewhere that we haven't, it's on the way to Stelmakivka, that's it. We've seen some advances further north of there previously, but this is quite a slightly new area of Russian advance, a little bit further to the south there. So that's another area of gain. What's mentioned was in Kislivka. I think we made that change to yesterday's map. So this is an accumulation of several changes going on there. I know it's a little bit confusing, but that large one that we just seen and what we saw yesterday. And then a slight gain, according to Surat maps, much further to the south there, on the way to the Geopolitics River, over... no, I think that's over the Geopolitics River just there, and that's further towards Yoskil River. But anyway, north of Makivka, the Russians have made some small gains near Karmazinivka, to be precise. So a bit of activity along that axis where the Russians are pushing and probing in multiple places, and some gains here in Bilahorivka. I find this pretty interesting. I'll talk about why in a second. We'll just go to Surat maps to see what their claims are. So the situation over the last 3 days as the Russian armies continue to enter into the centre of Bilahorivka. However, it is premature to talk about full Russian recapture of the locality as the Western Hills continue under the control of the Ukrainian army. Now, previously, we have had Surat maps, the pro-Russian mapper, saying the Ukrainians have made these gains all the way around here, including down along the line of this chalk pit. There were claims that while the Russians made those attacks, they were repelled, and then Surat maps had to walk back a claim in this northern area. It might have been Ukrainian counterattack, but it might also just have been the Russians attacking, getting repelled, but not actually controlling all of this area. There's a really big difference between the mappers here, as you can see. But again, we have the claim that the Ukrainians have been pushed back in central Bilahorivka and to, from the east of Bilahorivka towards the west. Now, what's difficult about this area for the Russians is, if you look at the chalk pit, they have to climb up this chalk pit, the sides of this, as Surat map still has them in control of part of this ledge, and the video evidence had them being pushed off that, and that being a failed attack. Reporting from Ukraine had stuff about that. Other open source intelligence sources just showed that the Russians did not control this, and in fact are likely back here where the other mappers say. And then when Surat maps have said they've made these further advances along this, they have had to come uphill from over here. There's several areas. It's just really, really difficult topography. So they've got to come down and then uphill up onto this higher ground here and over here, and different hills and undulating land. And they have to then come down into this low area where the Ukrainians are able to hammer them from up on high. And to think that they would have taken robust control over all of this ground in just a few days there, I find it's possible they might have had the ability to do that, but I find it unlikely. They have lost quite a lot of kit in this area recently. They've lost a lot of mechanized equipment. It's been caught on open source intelligence sources, geolocated and whatnot. All of these buildings in Bilahorivka, both on the high ground to the east, and as you come down into the low ground here and going uphill here, and actually it's caught on the Google Maps here, that is part of the updated area of the whole map. So Google Earth on Google Maps, they update their satellite imagery in bits and pieces, and all along the front line you have a different rendering as to what is actually going on. So some of the imagery here is from 2018, I think, even where their buildings are still looking like they're completely unaffected. And Billericay is an area where Google have updated this, not crazy recently, but to earlier on in the war, and each of these buildings is rubblized, right? It's completely, most of them are completely destroyed. They'll be even more destroyed now. So there is no shelter in this whole area. So the point of me going into all that detail is it's very difficult for the Russians to come up, get onto this high ground here, then downhill, then take control of all this area, take control of these rubblized buildings with little or no shelter. The basements might still exist in some of them, and then to stay there. Meanwhile, the Ukrainians, who are very well dug in here, can hammer them from on high, and because these, as mentioned, the topography here really suits kind of a status quo where you got all this high ground here where the Ukrainians can hammer the Russians, and you've got high ground over to the east where the Russians can hammer the Ukrainians if the Ukrainians were to attack in a similar fashion. So it tends towards a bit of a status quo there. That the Russians have taken that, I think, would be really significant if they have, but I think they're going to find it tough going, and we've seen Surat Mats make those claims before and they've not really come to fruition. Right, coming down past the Seversk front line, we eventually get to Bakhmut and to its west where we have Chasiv Yar. This has seen a lot more stabilization over the past week or so. There appears to be some gains going into the Canal micro-district, as according to both Deep State Maps and Andrew Perpetua, which I think is fairly significant because this is that inch by inch grinding process of taking ground that the Russians go into, and it looks like this area to the east of the canal just here is not long for Ukrainian control if it's agreed that by all the mappers that the Russians are in the easternmost reaches of that canal micro district. So they're going to be working themselves through there, and it is difficult for the Ukrainians to keep supplied because you've got the canal and many of the bridges along here will have been destroyed. There are culverts, so you can get across somewhat easily in certain places, but as far as supplying is going and using trucks or mechanized equipment to get serious amounts of supplies across, it might be a bit challenging. As you can see, hopefully from here, there are some bridges. We know that bridge is definitely blown up. I'm pretty sure that one will be blown up now. You've got the culverts where the canal goes under the ground in these two places, but there are pipes above the ground there as well that will offer a bit of an obstacle for vehicles to pass. And you've got trees both sides, so woodland both sides of that. So it means it's a good natural barrier, but for the Ukrainians who are on the eastern side of that, it's difficult for them to be, or more difficult for them to be consistently supplied. So as the Russians get further and further into here, the writing seems to be on the wall for the Ukrainians. Some gains there, as according to Andrew Perpetua and Deep State, although it has to be said, not for Surat Map. So it could be that is just a kind of agreement or something that Surat Map's claimed some time ago, and that might not have actually happened in the last 24 hours. Right, then as we come down past Klishivka, no change there. Down to the Avdiivka front line, and we can see quite a bit of change to that northern area. I probably missed a little bit up here. Yes, we'll come back to that at the end, actually. So anyway, as you can see here, it's quite a lot of activity going on. Deep State Maps has the Russians advancing a little bit north of Ocheratina, and then further to the northwest there, both Surat Maps and Deep State Maps showing some small tree line advances towards Nova Alexandriivka, and also further directly to the north of Ocheratina. That is just inching further and giving the Russians more and more territory, but with these movements, there are costs involved in terms of personnel and equipment. Now, interesting that Suriyat Maps has dialed it back for the Russians, going towards that road in the northwest there. So the edge of that sector, just to the west of Ocheritina, Russians might not have had such a success as he initially claimed. All the Russians have been pushed back by Ukrainian counterattack. Further to the south there, just west of Novobakhmativka and Solovyove, we have some Russian gains according to Deep State Map and Suriyat Maps. That seems fairly significant on the way to a small settlement called Sokil, although there's a slight pegging back of the Russians around Solovyove, so a little bit of a difference there. You have one mapper going one way and the other mapper going the other. So Andrew Perpetua and Deep State disagreeing with what's going on around Solovyove. Nonetheless, there are some gains for the Russians in all the different directions there, some small gains for the Ukrainians as well. And if we look at that from the Suriyat Maps point of view, after the capture of Umanska, they say the Russian army made advances north of Orlivka and Umanska line in the last 48 hours. In addition, Russian forces advance west of Solovyove and east and northeast of Novo-Oleksandrivka, where Russians have not yet managed to enter. On the other hand, the Ukrainian army managed to retake some positions along the railway, as mentioned there. So that's a claimed counterattack. We can't always assume it is. Sometimes Suriyat Maps just claims that Ukrainians counterattack, but actually it's evidence that the Russians had never taken that ground in the first place. So yeah, interpret that how you will, absent of any other evidence. And then we come further to the south here. We'll get to that in a second. To the other Suriyat Maps tweet there, Deep State Maps agreeing that the Russians have had some more success in the Netalove area to the west of Pervomaysky, and that's further south. But you can see, they're trying to obviously push as far to the west as possible to get towards Pokrovsk. This is often called the Pokrovsk direction. There's a bit of a pocket there. You can see they would obviously like to equalize that whole front line. But yeah, Deep State Map saying the enemy has occupied Netalove, so that's the acceptance that small place has fallen to the Russians. And then we come further to the south around Solodka, where the Russians have made some further gains. Here, just a field where the Russians have restarted advances in a direction of Vodyane, and this is in the direction of that road that connects Vuhledar past Vodyane up to Konstantinivka here. So where the Russians have, according to Deep State Maps, made some small advances west of Novomykhailivka, just south of Paraskevivka in that area. This is where the Russians would like to get to, Konstantinivka, so they will have control over this road coming down past Vodyane to Vuhledar, and that will allow them to attack eventually Vuhledar from the north, because attacking it from the south has been incredibly painful for them. They've lost huge amounts of equipment in trying to do that. This is high ground here, and that high ground is on the same level as that sort of ground here, so the Russians see it as easier to attack Vuhledar from that direction rather than going uphill from the south where they have previously been stung. Right, then we come along to the southern front line and the Velika Novoselka salient, where the Russians have had some more success. Here around Uruzhany, through Uruzhany, according to Suriyat Maps, they've added a few more streets to their control. According to Andrew Perpetua, some fairly significant advances that had already been clocked by Suriyat Maps and Deep State Maps. So in the area, the fields to the sort of west of Staromyorsk, the Ukrainians have been pushed back. This is what Suriyat Maps says of this area. During the last 3 days, the Russian army made small advances in the southern part of Uruzhany. On the other hand, the Ukrainian army retreated from big parts of Staromyorsk and only controls now 30% of the locality. So that's the idea that they're being pushed out of Staromyorsk and the Russians are making gains in this rural area, as according to Andrew Perpetua. Now, I don't think this is terribly significant. The Ukrainians took this back in the May counter-offensive, but I don't think it has any particular operational advantage. So if the Ukrainians do cede this land to the Russians, I'd actually much rather them lose this than lose anywhere over here, anywhere over here, and anywhere over here. So yeah, I'd much rather see them lose that. Interesting that Robotna today, no changes there. No changes to Dnipro either. So where Surret Maps yesterday had some big changes, so the Ukrainians controlling more of this land to the southwest of Krinky, possibly moving their forces from Krinky to the area on the way to Kozachi-Lahiri. And I've been hearing that actually the Ukrainians have fully pulled out of Krinky and pulled back across the river, possibly to reinforce up in Kharkiv. There's just confusion coming out here. There's different people saying different things, denials and claims from the Russians that seem to also be confusing matters. And yeah, so we'll wait to see what the actual reality of that is. But as you can see, quite a few gains for the Russians across a number of the usual places. They seem to go in fits and starts, and that leads me often to say, well, it looks like the Russians have culminated, which I think broadly they are. I don't think they've got an awful lot of strength in depth. They are grinding out these gains, but it comes at a huge cost. They're able to do that with the use of aviation and with the lack of Ukrainian manpower. The Ukrainians just need an absolute ton more people, and I think that is such an important component of the evaluation as to what Ukraine's options and potential chances of success going forward are. And I'm going to do a video on whether I think they will succeed and what success looks like. But the biggest challenge for the Ukrainians, because I hear some proper military analysts, not armchair generals like myself, just sitting online and speculating with my limited knowledge, but I hear, like, proper employed analysts. I heard one on Times Radio talk about, well, this is what Ukraine are going to do next, and etc., etc., etc. And I just think they don't have the people to do that. Like, I know that that's what you'd do if you had 100,000 people ready to go, but they are mobilizing. But I'm just not sure how Ukraine are going to be able to take huge amounts of land back when you've got dug-in Russians, unless they're able to pummel the crap out of the Russian positions with aviation. If they can get air advantage, then things start looking really different. What are the chances of them getting air advantage, let alone really you want air superiority and then air supremacy? If you had air supremacy where you just got complete control of the air, then you would just batter these frontline positions with bombs. You just bomb the hell. No, so in Iraq, in Desert Storm, the Americans bombed Iraqi defensive positions for a month, full on, just a month. And when I say bomb, I mean like the volume of ordnance being dropped was phenomenal, right? That's the kind of thing you want to do, but you want to do that for many more months along this whole front line. Then you can consider being able to retake this land. But there's an awful lot of steps you've got to make in order to regain air, well, not to regain, to gain air superiority. And that's not even supremacy. So are the Ukrainians going to be able to take this land back militarily? It's a tough call. I think one of the best options, if we're not going to go down the air superiority route, is hammering the Russians for long enough, so 6 months of absolutely hammering them, to the point where, their Black Sea Fleet is hammered in Novorossiysk, where Crimea is completely untenable, where you've had so many positions hammered back here for months and months, and where you've had oil refineries and air bases hit further back into Russian territory. And when you get Ukrainian troops being trained by Allied forces in the West, and you get maybe some air support in the West, then you can start seeing a reality whereby Putin, there's a coup, or Putin's health deteriorates, or there's some kind of uprising. I think uprising is one of the least likely things, but there could be a situation where he has no option but to start pulling out, and that's where you could see the Ukrainians militarily move forward, but it would require a situation that isn't them winning on the battlefield on the ground. The Ukrainians are not going to be able to do a sort of combined arms maneuver offensive where they destroy the Russians. I think for them to do that, the Russians would already have to be in a very, very bad place by either the air or distance munitions hammering the crap out the Russians. I think it can be done, and I think we can somewhat easily facilitate that happening. It just means we've got to move into proper help Ukraine mode in a way that we haven't so far done. We're just incrementally doing things bit by bit. If we just went all in, then I think it would happen. But anyway, that's my tuppence. That's giving you a kind of a window into my thought processes there that I will do an entire video on. Let me know what you think. That's enough of me banging on. Thanks so much for watching. Take care. Speak to you soon. Toodle pips.